Rick Grimes stared into the dying fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames that barely kept the cold at bay. Around him, the air was unnervingly still, save for the occasional groan of walkers in the distance. The group was camped along the remains of an old highway, cars rusting in neat clusters as if the people inside had simply vanished rather than succumbed to the horrors that came after. The camp was quieter now, less crowded. Too much had changed in 6 months. Too many had died, but some hadn't. Rick's gaze fell on a slender figure across the fire. Leah, one of the so-called immune, sat sharpening a blade with an almost mechanical precision. Her kind had been a mystery at first. A small population scattered throughout the ruins of the old world who never turned, no matter how many walkers bit, scratched, or bled on them. Immune people might get wounded, might even die, but they didn't change. They didn't transform. First, it had felt like salvation, proof that there was something left in humanity's fraying DNA worth holding onto. But that hope didn't last long. "You're staring again," Leah said without looking up, her voice sharp, cutting through the quiet night like a knife. Rick blinked, startled out of his thoughts. He adjusted the grip on his rifle and shifted his gaze back to the fire. "Didn't mean to, just thinking." "That's what you always say," she muttered, her hands never pausing their work. Across the camp, Daryl Dixon stepped out from the shadows, his crossbow slung loosely across one shoulder. He cast an uneasy glance at Leah before speaking. "We should move out at first light. This spot's too exposed." Rick nodded. "Agreed. Have you seen Michonne? She's scouting the perimeter." Daryl hesitated for a beat, then lowered his voice. "Rick, I don't trust her." Rick closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't the first time he'd heard it, or the last, he was sure. "She hasn't given me a reason not to. Immune or not, she's survived as long as the rest of us." "Yeah, but she's not like the rest of us, is she?" Daryl's tone darkened, his hand tightening on the strap of his crossbow. "She walks out there without fear. Don't matter how many of those things are out there. She acts like she's untouchable. And maybe she is, but that don't mean we can trust her." Rick looked over at Leah again. Immune survivors all carried that same aloofness, a distance that drew suspicion rather than sympathy. How could trust exist when survival was never a question for them? After half an hour, with a soft grunt, Michonne reappeared from the shadows, wiping blood from her katana. "Perimeter's clear. A few walkers, nothing major." She flicked her gaze toward Leah briefly before sitting down beside Rick. Her tired eyes spoke volumes, but she said nothing further, simply setting her weapon aside. There wasn't an ounce of wasted energy between any of them. Time had turned them into creatures of efficiency. "Good," Rick said, but there was little warmth in his agreement. Something was eating at him, gnawing away at his worn resolve like a festering wound. Earlier that afternoon, they'd raided an old hardware store for supplies. Not much had been left. Some nails, a dull hatchet, and a torn tent. But the 6 cans of soup they found in the rubble felt like sheer dumb luck. The joy had been fleeting. They'd run into another group not long after, this one made up entirely of vulnerable survivors. There had been no violence, but Rick wouldn't forget the way they flinched at the sight of Leah, as if she carried death in her very shadow. The rift was growing. Everywhere Rick looked, he saw cracks in the fragile alliances they tried to build. Some of the immune survivors had banded together, claiming their natural resistance somehow made them superior. Others, like Leah, had drifted toward groups like Rick's, trying to integrate but never quite fitting in. The world wouldn't just let them rebuild. It had other plans. "Leah," Michonne said suddenly, her voice shattering the brittle silence. "Why did your last group kick you out?" Lee's sharpening motion stopped abruptly. The steel of the blade gleamed in the firelight as she tilted her head toward Michonne, her expression unreadable. Rick straightened in his seat, uneasy. "I'm not sure that's any of your business." "I think it is," Michonne replied evenly, but her eyes were sharp. "We let you in. We share our food, our safety. This isn't a charity." Lee's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "The same reason you strays always end up on the road." Too many mouths. Not enough food. Doesn't take a genius to figure out who's dispensable when the immune can't turn. Daryl scoffed, leaning forward. So you just outlasted them, huh? Let him starve? Maybe they didn't kick you out. Maybe they ran to get away from you. Leah stiffened, and in that moment, every muscle in Rick's body coiled taut, ready to interrupt whatever inevitable explosion came next. Survival was hanging by frayed threads already, but Leah didn't explode. Instead, she chuckled low, humorless, and bitter as spoiled wine. Think what you want. I didn't take food from their mouths. Didn't need to. Walkers came before anyone had a chance to argue. Ever seen someone get eaten right in front of you? When there's no time to fight about who deserves to live more. Her words hung in the air, heavy and sour. No one responded. Hours passed, and the fire burned low. Rick sat watch, scanning the empty road for any sign of movement beyond the tree line. The darkness was dense, a suffocating veil that only amplified the gnawing unease threading through the camp. His mind churned. They needed to find someplace permanent soon, or at least more defensible. Too many of the places they'd tried to settle in hadn't lasted long. Not with the walkers, not with growing hostility between groups. Rick had never been naive, but hope was harder to hold on to now than it had ever been. His bones ached with exhaustion when he caught sight of a distant figure approaching from the tree line. It was Leah. She hadn't said a word before slipping off into the dark earlier, and now Rick rose, wary. Could have been dangerous, he murmured when she drew closer. Everything's dangerous, she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I needed air. Rick studied her, this woman who lived with none of the fear that gripped the rest of them daily. It wasn't arrogance, not exactly. It was simply the absence of a threat most people couldn't ignore. What was it like, he wondered, to move through this world without constant dread clawing at your back? You think they're right, don't you? Lee's voice was quieter than he expected. Rick frowned. Right about what? That we're monsters. That we don't care if they die because we can't. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to soothe her, offer some platitude that would bridge the growing chasm this world had carved between immune and vulnerable. But he didn't. Instead, he told the truth. I think people don't trust what they don't understand. You can't die like us. You don't lose as much. And it's hard for them to see how we'll ever be on the same side again. Lee's gaze dropped to the dirt. We didn't ask to be this way. And we didn't ask to be this way either. The silence between them stretched thin, fragile as glass. By dawn, the group packed up to leave the highway behind. Once again, they marched a fine line between surviving the walkers and surviving each other. Rick fell behind, scanning the ruined landscape with sorrowful eyes. Every step forward felt like dragging an anchor through mud, but he kept going. That's all he could do, except he couldn't stop thinking about what Leah said, about the bitter divide threatening to engulf them all. And he wondered, for the 100th time, if there really was any path forward that didn't end in blood. Because something told him that the fight for survival wasn't just against the walkers anymore. Maybe it never had been. The morning sun was pale and unforgiving, casting long, skeletal shadows over the broken highway as the group moved in a loose, tense formation. Rick stayed at the front, his shoulders set in that familiar rigid posture of someone carrying far too much weight. Behind him, Michonne was silent, her katana resting easily in her grip, but her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Daryl walked a few paces off to the side, his crossbow ready, the mistrust radiating off him like heat from smoldering coals. Leah trailed somewhere near the middle, alone but unbothered by the wary glances cast her way. Rick could feel the division crackling in the air like dry wood under pressure. It wasn't just Lee's presence. It was what she represented. Immunity, exclusion, survival without the same cost. To those still vulnerable, every step was a gamble with death, every scrape or bite a potential death sentence. But to the immune, it was hard not to see them as other. The first walker came shambling from a crumbled embankment about an hour into their march. Its legs were mangled, one dragging uselessly behind it, but its snarls were no less urgent. Daryl stepped forward before anyone else moved, loosing a bolt with practiced precision. The thing crumpled to the asphalt without much fanfare, and the group moved on in silence. Leah lingered a little longer than necessary, her gaze fixed on the corpse. Rick slowed his pace, waiting until she caught up. "You okay?" She didn't look at him. It never gets old, does it? How they keep coming, no matter how broken they are. Rick made a low sound in his throat, somewhere between a grunt and an agreement. They don't care about obstacles. They just exist to consume. Leah turned her head slightly, her face unreadable. Sometimes I wonder if that's what we'll all turn into. Maybe not physically, but inside, whether we're immune or not. It struck him as a question more than a statement, but he didn't answer. He didn't want to admit that he'd thought the same thing more times than he could count. By midday, they'd taken refuge in the remnants of an old rest stop. The sign for the place was hanging half-broken, the faded cheerful letters advertising clean bathrooms and free coffee. A cruel relic of what life used to be. As they secured the building, Rick checked every corridor methodically, ignoring the stale stench of rot and decay that never truly left the air anymore. Michonne called from the far side of the building. "Clear over here." Daryl appeared next, his crossbow slung low but his expression still hard. "No walkers, but the back entrance is busted. Won't hold if something tries to push through." Rick nodded, glancing toward the others. Leah had found a seat on the edge of a counter strewn with brittle maps and ruined tourist brochures, while the others milled in tense silence. No one sat near her. The fragile peace shattered when Michonne spoke up, her tone sharp, surgical. "We need to talk about food." Rick stiffened, knowing exactly where this was going. "We're down to 4 cans, she continued, her voice measured but unyielding. "And 7 of us." Leah looked up, her expression stony but her back straight. "I'll be fine with less. You've seen me eat. I don't need as much as you think." Michonne's gaze was steady, unrelenting. "That's not the point." Daryl cut in, his voice low but growling like a cornered dog. "The point is it's always the same story, ain't it? We scrape by, rationing every damn thing, and meanwhile you—" He gestured sharply toward Leah. "You're always fine. Every choice comes down to us risking something for you and you just endure." Leah sprang off the counter, her fists clenched. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be different or immune or whatever the hell you want to call it. No." Daryl's lips curled, his anger crackling like dry tinder. "But you sure seem okay benefiting from it." Rick stepped between them before the tension broke into something desperate and irreparable. His voice was low, commanding, but weary. "Enough." Michonne didn't look away from Leah, her blade resting against her thigh but her stance coiled. "This division, it's going to kill us all, Rick. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's coming. You know it as well as I do." "We survive together," Rick said, his jaw tightening as he willed the words to sound true. "We stop fighting or we die. That's all there is to it." Daryl snorted but didn't press further, his body radiating distrust as he moved toward the far side of the room. Leah didn't sit down again, her face carefully blank as she stared out the shattered window. As night fell, the tension lingered, thick as smoke. Rick sat watch again, rest elusive. Across the room, Leah leaned against the wall, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the flickering lantern. "Why do you keep me here?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness of the rest stop. Rick didn't turn to look at her. "Because everyone deserves a chance." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, sharp as a blade. "You really believe that?" He let out a long breath. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I know we don't get out of this alive if we start cutting people loose just because they're different." She didn't respond, and the silence between them stretched until Rick thought she might have fallen asleep. But then she spoke again, softer this time. "It's hard to stay, you know, knowing I'll outlive everyone in this room. Not because I want to, just because I can. And you all hate me for it." Rick turned toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "No one hates you, Leah. They're scared. And maybe that's worse. The howl of a distant walker echoed through the dark, a haunting, lonely sound. Rick and Leah both tensed, but it faded, lost to the heavy night. Neither of them relaxed. "We'll move again in the morning," Rick said after a long moment. "Try to put some more distance between us and that last group we ran into." Leah nodded faintly but said nothing. Somewhere behind them, Michonne stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent and distressed. Rick glanced over at her, then at the others spread out in uneasy rest. He wondered, not for the first time and certainly not the last, whether survival was even worth the cost anymore. The road stretched endlessly before them, lined with scattered remains of the world they once knew, but there was no destination, no promise of a better life waiting at the end. And yet they walked, because that was all they could do. Rick tightened his grip on his rifle and looked out into the night. Tomorrow would bring the same fights, the same fears, the same impossibly thin line between hope and despair. Maybe, just maybe, it would also bring something worth holding on to. The wind swept low over the crumbling rest stop, carrying with it the faint scent of decay that never truly left the air in this world. Rick shifted his weight against the frame of the doorway where he stood watch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. His eyes swept the horizon with practiced focus. The distant rustle of branches in the woods was just the wind, or so he told himself. Inside, the group stirred restlessly in their separate corners of the room. Daryl sat cross-legged by a boarded-up window, checking over his crossbow with methodical precision. His face was a storm cloud, all hard angles and suspicion that seemed carved into permanence. Michonne remained eerily still, her head tilted back against the wall, katana balanced across her lap. The others, all vulnerable, kept to themselves, side-eyeing Leah with a wariness they didn't even try to hide anymore. Leah sat apart, leaning against the far wall, running a cloth over her already pristine blade. Her expression was hard to read in the dim light, but her body language screamed what Rick already knew. She didn't feel safe here, not because of the walkers or whatever survivors might be prowling the roads, but because of the very people she shared the room with. Rick turned his gaze back to the horizon. He knew that feeling intimately. The morning came too soon, pale and gray, the kind of light that washed everything in cold indifference. The group packed up in silence, tension hanging over them like smog. Rick led the way, boots crunching across gravel as they made their way back to the main road. Daryl took up the rear, his head swiveling in near-constant vigilance. Leah remained somewhere in the middle, her steps steady, but her presence felt more like weight dragging at the group than an asset. By mid-morning, they reached an old bridge spanning a shallow, sluggish river. Cars were jammed bumper to bumper across it, rust blooming in angry patterns along their sides. The windows were smashed in nearly all of them, and Rick could see the telltale stains of long-dried blood coating the cracked windshields. "We'll cross here," Rick decided, his voice low but firm. "Bad idea," Daryl muttered, his eyes scanning the bridge with an uneasy twitch. No other way. No one argued further, but the hesitation rippled through the group. As they began picking their way across the bridge, Rick felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Every footfall echoed too loud in the silence. The cars loomed on either side like sentries, blocking their view. Every shadow could be hiding something that would shatter the fragile calm they clung to. Halfway across, the attack came. The first walker stumbled out from behind a crushed pickup. Its jaw hung slack, one side completely torn away, but its dead eyes locked onto the group with primal purpose. Before Rick could even raise his rifle, more appeared. Dozens. They must have been trapped in the cars, lying dormant until the noise of the group stirred them to life. "Shit!" Daryl hissed, already loosing a bolt into the nearest rotted skull. Chaos erupted. Rick shouted orders that were drowned out by the guttural snarls of the dead. Michonne was a blur of lethal efficiency, her katana flashing as she cut through one walker after another. The vulnerable survivors clung to the group's perimeter, swinging makeshift weapons with unpracticed desperation. Leah didn't hesitate. She darted forward, slashing and stabbing with a ferocity that seemed almost reckless. The walkers reached for her, clawing and snapping with wild hunger, but her immunity turned their bites into nothing more than useless attempts at destruction. "Behind you!" Rick bellowed, firing his rifle and taking down a walker lunging toward Lee's back. She barely flinched, spinning to impale another that came too close. The fight dragged on, every second stretching into an eternity. Rick felt the burn in his arms, the weight of his rifle growing heavier with each shot. His finger was numb from pulling the trigger, and then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The E-bridge was silent again, save for the ragged breathing of the group. Walker corpses littered the ground, some still writhing with residual reflexes. Rick reloaded his rifle, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline drained from his system. "Everyone okay?" he called out, his eyes scanning the group. "Fine," Michonne said, wiping blood off her blade with the sleeve of her jacket. Daryl grunted an affirmative, yanking one of his bolts free from a skull. The other survivors murmured similar responses, some clutching bruised arms or scraped knees. No bites, no scratches. They'd gotten lucky. Rick turned to Leah, who stood a few paces away, her blade still slick with gore. Her chest heaved with exertion, but she looked otherwise unharmed, except for her eyes. They held a storm that Rick had come to recognize all too well, the weight of unspoken words. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly, her voice carrying over the dead-still air. Rick frowned. "Do what?" "Save me." She gestured to the corpse at her feet, its head split cleanly in two from Rick's shot. "Why waste a bullet on me when they can't hurt me?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, searching for an answer, but nothing came at first. "Because none of us are invincible," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Immune or not, you still bleed. You can still die. And maybe," he hesitated, lowering his gaze, "maybe I'd like to think that saving you means saving something more than just another body." Leah blinked, her expression wavering for the first time since he'd met her. She looked away, wiping her blade clean on the hem of her jacket. "We should keep moving," Michonne interjected, her voice tense. She was already scanning the far side of the bridge, her fingers tight around the grip of her katana. Rick nodded, rallying the group with a curt wave. As they continued their trek, he couldn't shake the weight of Lee's question, or the deeper questions it stirred in him. By late afternoon, they stumbled across an abandoned motel just off the highway. It was a pitiful thing, half the building sagging under the weight of neglect and weather, but it had walls and doors that might still lock. "Better than nothing," Rick muttered, pushing inside with his rifle drawn. The group swept the building cautiously, taking out a handful of walkers shuffling aimlessly in the wreckage of the lobby. Rick and Daryl secured the perimeter while Michonne inspected the rooms, ensuring they were free of threats, human or otherwise. By nightfall, they'd settled into the small, moldy confines of the second floor. Rick sat cross-legged against the wall, his rifle laid across his lap. The others were scattered throughout the room, keeping their distance from one another. It was during this uneasy quiet that one of the vulnerable survivors, Lynn, a wiry woman with short-cropped hair, finally spoke up. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling but insistent. "Doing what?" Michonne asked without looking up from her blade. "Dragging her along." Lynn's gaze darted to Leah, then back to Rick. "It's not right. She doesn't fight for what we fight for. She doesn't have to. And every time we put our lives on the line for her, we lose something. Something we don't get back." Lee's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. "She fights," Rick said, his voice clipped. "She saved plenty of you today." "That's not enough," Lynn shouted, her voice rising to a near-panicked pitch. "It's not enough that she helps. She doesn't understand. She can't. She'll outlive all of us, unless we die because of her first." "That's enough," Rick snapped, his tone cutting through the fraught air like a knife. But the damage was already done. The words hung heavy in the room, stirring resentments that had already been bubbling beneath the surface. Leah stood abruptly, her knife in hand, though she didn't brandish it. Her voice was steady, but it wavered at its edges. "You think I don't get it?" she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "You think I don't carry this every goddamn day? Knowing that I'll probably bury every one of you? Knowing you think I'm a liability because nothing can kill me the way it can kill you? You're right. I don't get what it's like to fear every scrape and splinter. But don't you dare act like I haven't paid for surviving." No one spoke. The air stilled, as if even the wind outside had stopped to listen. "You think it's easy? Knowing every group I've joined ends up hating me just as much as they need me? You think it's easy watching people die over and over and knowing you'll still wake up tomorrow alone again because you can't break like they do?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, the weight of her isolation filled the room like smoke, suffocating and undeniable. Rick stepped forward, his expression softening. "We don't hate you, Leah." "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "But you don't trust me either, and that's close enough." No one stopped her as she walked out, leaving the group to stew in the silence she left behind. Rick stared at the door, his chest heavy with the weight of all the things he wanted to say but couldn't. He didn't expect to find her sitting on the motel's roof an hour later, her knife still in hand. The moonlight cast her in stark relief, making her look more like a ghost than a survivor. "I don't blame them," Leah said softly as Rick approached. "I don't. In their shoes, I'd probably feel the same way." Rick sat down beside her, his knees groaning in protest. "You can't carry their fear for them. They'll figure it out or they won't. But either way, you keep walking, same as the rest of us." Leah didn't answer right away. For a long time, they just sat in silence, staring out over the ruined world that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Sometimes I wish I could just stop," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. Rick didn't look at her, but his voice was steady when he replied. "Stopping's not in our nature, no matter what we've lost, no matter how hopeless it feels." Leah exhaled slowly, the sound carrying with it some of the tension that had weighed her down. "Yeah, maybe." The night pressed on, heavy and endless. Below them, the others slept fitfully, searching for peace in a world that refused to give it. Rick and Leah sat shoulder to shoulder, two survivors on opposite sides of a divide neither of them had asked for, staring into the same unforgiving night.